imagining communities differ not accordingly to whether they are true or false, but according to their style. Similarly, the kind of daydreaming and imagination excited and elicited by the internet have a particular style, which remain to be elucidated. I argue that the style of imagination that is deployed in and by internet dating sites must be understood in the context of a technology which disembodies encounter, makes them encounters, must be understood in the context of a technology which disembodies encounters, makes them pure psychological events, and textualizes subjectivity. To unravel this style and its connection to disembodiment, let me first proceed a contrario by analyzing what is involved in meeting another face-to-face, body-to-body. This is where it gets kind of hectic. First, Joffman suggests that when two people are co-present, they exchange two types of information, the one they give and the one they give off. Goffman suggests that in an actual encounter, it is the information people give off rather than that they freely give. Goffman suggests that in an actual encounter, it is the information people give off rather than that they freely give that is crucial. The information that they give off, despite their best self, so to speak, is very much dependent on the ways in which they use their body, voice, eyes, body posture, etc., thus suggesting that much of our interactions are a sort of negotiation between what we consciously monitor and what we have no control over. In other words, if in body interactions there is a certain gap or lag between what we say, between how we want to present ourselves and what we want and what we have no control over, then this makes it more difficult to describe what is most important about ourselves in words, given that it is precisely that which we are not aware of which is most likely to make a significant impression on the person we meet. This part's boring. This is further illuminated by the work of cognitive psychologist Timothy Wilson, who has studied the non-conscious self as distinguished from the Freudian unconscious. As he claims, there is increasing evidence that people's constructed self bears little correspondence to their non-conscious self. The non-conscious self constitutes the set of automatic responses to the world which we have little knowledge of and over which we can exert little control. I have a note that says, why? This in turn means that people do not and probably cannot know themselves well, and that they do not really know what kind of person will make them feel what. As Wilson says, we simply seem to be bad at understanding or predicting our emotional states. I would add that we are bad at doing that, even though we seem to have accumulated so much psychological knowledge about ourselves. Second, Goffman has suggested, moreover, that in a situation of physical co-presence, there arises a sense that, quote, people are close enough to be perceived in what they are doing, including their experiences of others, and close enough to be perceived in this sense of being perceived. This means that the interaction is a subtle process of adjusting what we say or how we behave to the perceived co-presence of another. From this co-presence arises a kind of special mutuality. Goffman is referring here to a form of practical knowledge of sociability, which is incompatible with cognitive knowledge. The internet disturbs the kind of semi-conscious adjustment we make in concrete interactions precisely in giving precedent to cognitive text-based knowledge. Let me give one example of that. The author of a guidebook on dating recounts that he once had a client named Helen who told him about a man who was interested in her in real life. She went and actually checked his dating profile and found that he was 3 years older than his desired cutoff age, that she was 3 years older than his desired cutoff age. In other words, they would have never been able to meet on the internet. The internet renders one of the central components of sociability far more difficult, namely our capacity to continuously negotiate with ourselves the terms on which we are willing to enter into a relationship with others. Because the internet reifies our tastes and opinions, the success of a meeting will depend on its capacity to reproduce and correspond to the written text of pre-established preferences, thus preventing the kind of co-presence Goffman was referring to. For example, Olga, a 31-year-old strikingly attractive journalist living in California, admits she had to use the internet since 1995 without much success, by which she means that she met a number of men who disappointed her soon after meeting them. In the last few months, however, she's been in a serious relationship with a man, a scriptwriter from Hollywood, whom she met on the internet. I asked her to explain why this worked with one man and why it didn't work with another. That's kind of boring, but another implication is that despite their best efforts to control their attraction to a potential partner, people in fact just don't know what will make them attracted to someone else. In that respect, we may invoke here Merleau-Ponty's critique of the empiricist's approach to perception of the phenomenal. He agrees that the empiricist empties perception and feeling, sentir, and what he calls its mystery. Merleau-Ponty distinguishes between sentir and connaître, where the latter refers to an apprehension of the object based on properties, or what Merleau-Ponty views as dead qualities of the object. Feeling, on the other hand, refers to the experience of the active properties of the object. To see a motionless body is not the same as seeing a moving body. What is forgotten when perception is treated as an act of knowing, Merleau-Ponty claims, is the existential background. Bourdieu, reviving Merleau-Ponty, employs a similar argument by putting the body squarely at the center of social interactions. After 200 years of pervasive Platonism, it is very hard for us to think that the body can think itself through a logic alien to the act of theoretical reflection. I'll stop there. Yeah, it's funny with I feel like these are like kind of white theorists struggling with like, you know, the kind of thing that we talked about with in the Fetish Revisited, you know, like how so many different like white social technologies like have been infused and impacted by like plantation surveillance technologies and like kind of like other means of like like enclosure movements and like I feel like there's like an affective register of like, it's like that Buck Morris thing of the separation between an idea of freedom when Hegel writes about Hegel writes about the master-slave dialectic during the Haitian Revolution, like, and to not link the two like directly or overtly, you know, it's like to see sort of like a very, I mean, I think it produces a sense of a white consciousness or something around how perception works. And I really like this how she goes from Freud through Ponty in internet dating, but it's like, I think, you know, there's like that like whiteness seeing itself, you know, like missing so many vital points and sort of like, I don't know, like vital, that logic of like kind of like cold intimacy, like it's like obviously that'll be the production of family structures post-colonially for, you know, people who inherit advantageous structural like sort of like positioning, you know, and like the field that she kind of opens up. It really, I like there's another person, Miranda Fricker, who writes about the virtuous moral perceiver, and it's like, it's just very Karen energy. I don't know. I like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think finding what's missing in certain stuff is really like interesting and fun. And when you read that, it reminded me of an old essay that I wrote that I think I'm going to read from, which is kind of dealing with a similar thing of these white theorists who are like really close to, you know, the thing, but they're missing the component of actual history, actual present, actual, you know, understandings of anti-Blackness and what's actually happening in the world. Yeah, so this essay is called "Is the Face a Screen?" And it's basically pitting Levinas and Glissant. Emmanuel Levinas tells us that the face of the other, in its defenseless nudity, cries out, "Do not kill me." The face ordains and orders us as if a master spoke to us, unquote, framing an encounter between oneself and one's duties to the other. For Levinas, the other's face accuses us with its naked frailty, not with speech, but with expression, and for this reason, the encounter forms the basis of ethics for Levinas. The face's very exposure and weakness gives it power. Levinas claims that at the site of encounter, the self must decide how to respond to the cry of the face, which punctures the vacuum-sealed world of personal desires and intentions to present itself as more real than the self, as the whole of, quote, signification without context, unquote, which reveals the possibility of an outside to quotidian reality. Levinas says the face speaks as it renders possible and begins all discourse. But this speech is not linguistic. On the contrary, the face is a non-linguistic point of reference that also enables us to break the vicious circularity of the symbolic order. This rupture provides our world with the ultimate foundation, the absolute authenticity. In developing his position, Levinus broke with his teacher Martin Heidegger and shifted the ground of philosophy from the self's mortality or being toward death, sein zum Tod, to the call of the other. This contemplation regarded the other's mortality in particular, embodied in the defenseless nudity of the face, which holds unspeakable power over the gazer, according to Levinus. Its ineffable expressivity calls out to us, commands us, but a cursory glance at the violence of history in the present calls Levinus's formulation into question. If the face had the kind of power Levinus claimed, then the settler, the slaver, the officer, the teacher, the missionary, the speculator would have been ordered and ordained, unquote, not to kill. This call for a recalibration of the power Levinus finds in the other's face becomes necessary. If the face is indeed signification without context or meaning before language, then it has significant structural overlap with the hyperreality of commodities, which are empty signifiers unmoored from context, which places us in asymmetrical relations. It would be reductive to read Levinus's use of quote unquote other as pointing to other people, but this reductiveness is pedagogically instructive in light of the overlap. The face of the other is able to launch wars, and despite its plea for mercy, it has not stopped the ongoing march of violence and exploitation. On the contrary, its thrall over the gazer seems to only go in one direction, toward violence and marketization. According to Zizek, anchoring ethics to the other's face as Levinus would have it is therefore a priori impossible, since the limitation of our capacity to relate to the other's face is the mark of our own finitude. Instead, for Zizek, the face of the other does the work of quote unquote cementing normativity. Encountering the bottomless other means accepting one's own limitations and mortality. One's own life is framed by the deaths of others and by one's relation to those deaths. To continue the proposed reductive reading of Levinus I've anchored above, the cry of others' faces is exactly what most Western people spend their lives trying to avoid confronting, hearts full of vague dread with the sense that in whatever intangible way they are responsible. For what? For everything, given the violence and wastefulness of so many modes of Western existence. And it is this not knowing which becomes the spectacle, the impossibility to articulate, which becomes a commodity. And it may cause the most pain because avoiding the other's face is ultimately as self-centered and necropolitical as white Western savior complexes are. In this way, the West treats the other's face as a kind of screen or a surface of mediation. The encounter between self and other entails the presence of another, a mediating force like the state, which Levinus calls the third. Zizek argues that the limitation of our ethical relation of responsibility toward the other's face necessitates the rise of the third or domain of regulations. Here we begin to see the true treatment of the other's face and the reaction of the Western self to the wordless accusation of difference, the gesture to the Western finitude. The other's face is a kind of landscape of colonial shame, a screen the Western self uses to project the presence of the state, the settler, the slaver, the officer, the teacher, the missionary, the speculator, and simultaneously deny the existence of anything but the Western self. What is this screen-like quality of the face under Western colonization of the other? It is reminiscent of the Lumiere effect, named after the legendary story in which the train depicted the Lumiere brothers' 50-second film L'arrivée d'un train en gare de la Ciotat from 1895. We all know about this film. We don't need to go into this. Blah, blah, blah. The notion of mistaking representation for reality resonates with the way that for the Western self, the face of the other implies and requires a third perspective or state to mediate, translate, and sublimate. And the resulting panic of this conflation allows one to consider how for the West, the other's face justifies the necessity of the state, its always already there presence, as well as indicating the West's own always already mediated, even imaginary status. The other's face demands a performative suspension of disbelief in the Western mind, for it is like an event horizon in its accusation and difference, revealing nothing regardless of the quality of the gaze. Time after time, conquest after conquest, the West continues to see reality as secondary to imaginary, timeless, perfect forms of design, whatever shape these pseudo-concepts take. Confronted with reality's violence, the Western mind turns to skepticism, disbelief unsuspended. theater lights turned back on, snacks eaten. I'm unsure if anything except me is real, the ultimate solipsist perspective. The other appears as all variety of monsters and fantastical beings encroaching on this perspective of solipsism, and the West believes all manner of reaction is justified in the terrifying encounter described by Levinas. I've already called the cops. That's the white person's face. One takes the role of the state into one's own hands. And yet the face of the other is sticky. After images remain haunting conceptual spaces that Westerners thought had been cleared by state intervention. These traces have a Lacanian flair of a big other that structures or governs anxieties and reactionary impulses of Western subjects. Thus, the other's face takes on phantasmagoric commodity properties, to cite Benjamin. Its expressiveness is reduced to a platform for self-actualization, a screen to talk back to. Zizek argues the other's face is the ultimate fetish, inscribing terms of normativity for the Western mind. Its very expressivity, its screen-like quality, is the means by which the Western subject projects itself from the violence of reality, from the actual terror of white existence, which remains remains regardless of one's complicity in others' pain. The need for constant transparency. All right, this goes on for a while, but basically I keep going and say that this need for constant transparency can be kind of countered by Glissant's opacity, and that the digital kind of reifies this call for constant presence, constant difference, constant availability.
Wow,
So
when
yeah,
did you when did you write?
2018 or something.
Hi, yeah, Demoiselle d'Avignon, the face of the other.
Exactly.
So
Yeah,
real.
exactly.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm gonna read this. It reminds me so much of the 2D class I teach. But like how design functions like from that kind of primitivism, like capture by the modernist to like actually just sort of become some of the foundations for visual abstraction as well. And then that also happens with sound, because they're doing like especially when I talk about like plantation surveillance technologies, like meaning like, you know, record record like field recordings to radio media, and then other kinds of like media archives that sort of like media containing practices or seizing practices that like were subject, like slave bodies were subject to, like kind of like become a lot of the scape of the digital. You know, it's like capture, like monetizing those means of communications that were like witnessed on those dynamics. You know, like Woods talks about that. Damn, I didn't bring out the Clyde Woods. How do we not? Oh yeah, I did. I have Development Arrested. Maybe I'll read a bit from this too, though. So digital culture, a micro-archival present. This is from Wolfgang Ernst. The delayed present, media-induced temporalities, and the techno-traumatic irritations of the contemporary. Media archaeology of the present. Media archaeology analysis starts with the present itself, an algorithmicized cultural practice. The present is immediately quantized, sampled, and held, which is the electric precondition for real-time digital signal processing. The audiovisual and textual present is being temporarily stored or even archived as soon as it happens, from Twitter messages to instant photography to sound recording. Even more dramatically undoing the traditional order of times, big data and analytics algorithmically predicts the imminent future already as a future in the past, a futurum exactum. Never has a culture been more dynamically archival than the present epoch. By chrono-technical immersion, media archaeology aims at co-analyzing such conditions as they happen. Different from the traditional claim of historicist humanities that critical observation is possible only from a temporal distance, a time lag. Different from analog live transmissions, what changes with computational electronic media is the intervention of micro-storing procedures. There is an ongoing sublime micro-archiving of the present moment in digital media. The micro not only refers to the scale of integrated circuits, but to the ephemeral, transient temporality of operations with intermediary short-term storage of data for transmissions and processing. Does this not sound like the Underground Railroad? I don't know. It's just like, I'm like, it's so funny again. That kind of like container.
This shit rocks. You gotta keep going.
Okay.
It's very like topical.
It's very topical. The traditional logocentric notion of the present as a punctual now is irritated by such temporal disruptions. Temporary electric temporary electronic storage is quite the opposite of the non-rewritable storage medium of the printed text. It is apparent in the update frequencies of entities in the online encyclopedia Wikipedia. Digital communication is a system of well-defined, discrete, logical, and sequential microstates called data processing. It is permanently archiving the present, but not in the precise sense of archiving terminology. While the spatial archive, quote, presents us with multiple durations simultaneously, the digital archive is essentially processual in terms of the Turing machine. Epistemologically, that is more dramatic than the technology. Epistemologically, this is more dramatic than just the technological precision of Derrida's neo-graphism difference. The archive itself transforms from its formerly almost frozen temporality into an immediate extension of the algorithmicized present. The contemporary time technologies therefore result in redefinitions of the archive. Electronic signal recordings differ from previous archival records by its technical latency. The replay, like a musical performance, quote, does not represent anything anymore but pure presence. Different from reading archival documents of the symbolically registered past, which needs to be decoded in terms of historical context. For media culture, the essential scene of representation is the electromagnetic field. Early analog television broadcasting just knew live transmissions. Even when documentary film footage from the archives is displayed on the History Channel of BBC television, the temporal message of the medium is the radical presentation of live transmission with the speed of light, different from the rhythm of online immediacy in the World Wide Web with its, quote, randomization of knowledge about the historical past by search engines and the, quote, digital histories in computer games. In the social media portal Facebook, a timeline runs across the individual profile, moving from the date of birth to the present day, continually updated and updatable. But within the digital computer, the timing of the Unix operating system, so-called Unix time, counts the number of seconds that have elapsed since 000000 coordinated universal time on January 1st, 1970. And any algorithmic procedure based on that time could be, by numerical extrapolation, time shifted into the future. Aristotle's definition of time as coming into existence by numerical measuring becomes operational in digital computing. In otherworldly physical experience, both mechanical and electronic storage devices, which allow for time invariant replay of audio signals, are themselves increasingly subject to macrotemporal decay over time, such as the material deterioration of Edison cylinders or magnetic tapes. But once the signal has been digitized, at least in terms of information theory, it becomes timeless. The technical recording of the present has been a general phenomenon of media culture since the shrinking exposure of times of classical photography, before electromagnetic waves were applied to transmit signals with the speed of light. But different from live transmissions in previous times of analog electronic video and television, digital communication happens in, quote, real time, which suggests instantaneity. Viewed under a time lens, there is a process of constant micro-archiving, a data for further processing. In contemporary culture, for the first time, we are really living in an archive culture, not in its institutional sense, but in terms of micro-storage acts which characterize digital data processing within the heart. ALU, arithmetic logic unit of computing. I'll read one more part because I think this last part about chronophotography is interesting. Cinematographic sampling and the visual present of the moving still. The human sense of the present is kinetically affected by the moving still. As technical event, the intermittent stepwise transport of the film reel. There is the moving still, which is the experimental genre of the photo film, evokes as a re-entry on the media dramaturgical level. Film once irritated the notion of pastness as distinct from the present. The mechanical reanimated celluloid strips as chronophotographic sequence of still frames induces the impression of continuous movement in the mind of the spectator. Cinematography blurs the difference between present and past, and thereby evokes the notion of the undead. Just like the stationary shot or fixed frame camera setup dissolves the dichotomy of still versus moving. David Clarabout's visual installations unfolded, and it's kind of boring. Bergson describes the delusion of cinematographic movement in terms of the clock mechanism. In the brothers Lumiere camera projector, the perforated film is driven by an intermittent mechanism indeed, but within technologically embedded algorithmic computing, the central system clock is just the provider for electronic impulses, which are subsequently broken into sequential units, with the delimiting time critical factor of dead time switching between 0 and 1 voltage levels. In data processing, a complex drama of synchronous and asynchronous cycling and phase shifting occurs. Implemented as material machine, temporalities are suddenly embodied in the regime of the symbolic. In Turing's definition of digital computation, this introduces discreteness into movement, and at the same time, it smears the present. In the analysis of coexistent temporalities, media archaeology research is not about the true nature of time, but rather unfolds the operative process dualities of technical media in combination with neurological signal processing within humans, which results in phenomenological perceptions of the present. Yeah.
Dope.
I feel like that's, yeah. I like that.
Fuck yeah.
I feel it's very like Black Twitter. It's very like call and response to Black Twitter, to like sleeper cell technology, to like algorithmic oppression, like in like a very, very short, like sweet little book. It also, again, like doesn't say any of that. You know, it's like the extension of like, you know, through like the digital. I mean, I feel like, yeah, thinking about algorithmic oppression too, like just how much of like, I think like, yeah, the idea of like kind of short spurts of unsynchronous. I mean, this is like the spiralist. It's like Frank Etienne. It's like sort of so many technologies for communicating across like the, you know, impermanent threat of having like forms of communication seized and like falsely, or not falsely, but like, you know, negative, like, I don't know how to say that, semantically weaponized or something. Mm-hmm. All lives matter, like since 1492 or whatever, you know, like, or Hegel in Haiti.
Yeah, it's like the basis of media in the sense of timelessness. It like immediately links to anti-Blackness, right? And the anti-Blackness of media, because Black people were kept outside of time, you know?
And through kept outside of time, and through suppressions of media kept outside of time, like, and I feel like in so many ways, like made into the digital process itself, like so many technologies of like slave making technologies are perceptual technologies. Mm-hmm. And they're like, those are the sets of data, you know, or the set, like the cultural imagination or something that we like inherit now. Like seeing like how anti-Blackness operates on TikTok is just like so wild, like phenomenologically.
It's just like folk etiology or something, like non-doctors diagnosing shit, but then also doctors diagnosing shit from their own anti-Black biases, you know?
Literally, yeah. And I mean, also this kind of like sleeper cell technology that is kind of like Black gesture, you know what I mean? Like there's so many different nuanced performances that like just, I mean, even the idea of like attentive recognition or like Bergson's kind of like treatment of like the perception of images is like, it's just the tip of the iceberg when you think about the slave looking at the master, you know what I mean? As a site of knowledge, like, yeah, so there's just so many ways where like that, like even the way that he talks about signal and signal processing, I'm just like, I feel like when I think about it, I think about how like the stage is laid out for the minstrel performance, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And how kind of attentive recognition like boomerangs around that audience to perform like, you know, extraction, but also like safety, but also like outlandish. So I mean, not outlandish even, but like just, you know, very cutting sort of criticism or performance also, you know, like the communication technology is like, it's how like Matori also talks about, you know, how people make gods, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then again, just sort of seeing like the life of the digital, like kind of be like, I think proceed from a culture that's really like understood how to monetize even the small, or like not even monetize, but like really weaponize even the most nuanced forms of communication or micro communication, you know, towards like calculation, you know? I mean, it's just like, it feels like this is hectically Hotep, but maybe like overseer mathematics or something. Like,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I feel like the performativity of affect in general is built on minstrelsy, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no imagination of the concept of affect without that stage and the cork and the burnt cork and, you know, the green room to cork up and all this shit. Like,
And the accomplices and that whole, like, yeah, all of the accomplices, like, behind the camera and on stage in an audience, like, but also that those become, like, I like that essay. I forget the name of the author, but the gracefully policing the Tyler Perry phenomenon. There's an essay called "Gracefully Policing the Tyler Perry Phenomenon," which actually, you know, kind of talks about how a lot of early Black filmmakers, and I think in you know, corrective measures, also use characterization in their or caricature, you know, like stereotypical Black caricaturization in their work, and that those kind of like that language or those signals is also like, I don't know, there's another market for its authenticity that like is located really outside of whiteness, you know, but still also contained by you know, white means of like production.
mm-hmm.
And they're also like completely, I don't know, just gets like even more kind of like it's just like it's an even more nuanced performance, like, system of communication even then, right? Like how respectability operates through the minstrel politics of like Tyler Perry is like I don't know, it's like a conversation that's been happening for at least 200 years now in like Black critical
Mm-hmm.
thought. You know, like it's like, but it's so uncalculatable, you know what I mean, in terms of gesture and like in like when you witness it sort of like affectively, like I just like watching Black as Fuck is just wild, you know what I mean? I don't know where I am. You know what I mean?
I
Like
tried
when it's
with Blackish. I did.
I don't know where I am when I'm watching it. I'm like, what? There's nothing to hold on to, or like, you know, like, and then the way it kind of like the rewriting, like using the kind of Spike Lee, I don't know, whatever. I'm spiraling. Actually, can't spiral on Black. It's a spiral though. I know, it's such a spiral. That fool. America's Next Top Model. Like I wasn't even on that really. Like when it was happening. You auditioned?
I loved America's Next Top Model. That show was so good. But you watch it back now and it's so evil.
It's evil. I remember watching like watching bits of it and being like my students. I had like hella students in like New Orleans who would be like, I just want to go to Paris one day and be eyes, and I'd be like, you can't watch that. I remember literally sending people home and being like, look, to your parents, you can't. Why are they watching this? Just from the descriptions of stuff, like when she put on the fat suits and stuff, I was like, this is really not okay. In the prison episode, like didn't feel okay.
Oh my God.
Yeah. There was just so much. I remember hearing about Third Pand and I was just like, what is this? And now, yeah, like watching everyone else excavate it is like so crazy. And his like new stuff is just like watching Orwell, or not Orwell, sorry, Orson Welles like emerge as a Black man on Netflix.
The Black Rosebud.
Literally Black Rosebud. It's Black Citizen Kane. What is happening?
Yeah.
So wild with the gray sweatsuit. It's season 2, like 2020. 2020 saw the opening and the second season of Black as Fuck. Just if that's not acceleration.
I was thinking about Arya Dean and like the always already Black nature of accelerationism, right?
Totally. So already Black.
Yeah, I remember like the 90s and like you remember like Cornel West and like Victor Anderson and all these people going against what they call Black nihilism.
I kind of remember that. I don't really I have like an academic memory before I moved to Germany, I think.
It was like a
Walter.
class illiteracy thing. They basically were looking at like Black hood culture and being like, oh, this is nihilism, this is blah blah blah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
And being like anti-nihilism because like respectability
Yeah.
or
Yep.
okay. Oh, that's boring. I want to read like Black People now, but before the light goes away completely, and then I should.
Okay.
I want to read this one, Simone White, and like shout out to Simone White for like teaching me about poetry and time for real with this book. Okay, How I Have Loved You for How Long. Promises a field. One gathers or arranges the scope of unkept promises, partly a function of memory, partly a function of organic remaining. I stay, therefore I remember what has not come to pass, what drags remains is remaining. The field is a field of action, and it is a field of smoke. To arrange is nothing, arranged nothing. Promises, radiant formations of intuited nothing. Each a sluice, sluice. Every other threatens to drown. Take the open space, the field. What has occurred also nothing, as between two others, incomparable between, event at all times. Perhaps there is another sun, for these gravities are evidence of unlikeliness, distracting solutions presented by physical laws. From these, nothing can be derived. From these, nothing cannot be derived, nor the field, nor promises, nor the coming flood of what can be called smoke. What is blown by the things are not light between us. Us is a metaphor for nothing, for remaining in this nothing, which is a category of absolute destruction, absolute despair, absolute possibility. Take that position, take that space, not position. I really like that. I kind of butchered that text, but it's really nice.
So good.
Yeah.
This is a poem by Afro-Dominican poet Ada Cartagena Puerto Latin. I'm going to read the original and then the translation that I did a couple months ago. It's called De la ausencia tuya. Ausencia tuya, nunca he estado sola. Tu recuerdo es pasaporte de mis viajes. Si tu ausencia fuera la ausencia de los otros, si te presintiera como estrella lejana, vacilante, entonces no sería tu ausencia la ausencia, sería el dolor de la muerte. Tu palabra fue más que una palabra y te hice ídolo en mi templo en llamas, donde estaremos hasta siempre, la muerte. Si tu ausencia no se hubiera eternizado como una luz o una sombra, yo no estaría ausente. En un continuo viaje iría hacia ti, persiguiendo tu presencia. So I translated the title as Of the Lack of You. The lack of you has never been alone. Your memory is the passport to my journeys. If your absence were the absence of others, and I presaged you like a distant star, hesitant, then the lack of you wouldn't be absence. It would be death's pain. Your word was more than a word, and I idolized you in my burning temple, where we shall be forever, death. If your absence hadn't eternalized like a light or a shadow, I wouldn't be absent. In one continuous journey, I'd go toward you, chasing your presence.
Mm.
The poet by a Black American poet named Jay Wright. It's called Veil. It's the first section of a long poem called Veil. There's something about the blood in a sunset that answers no questions. The tarnished veil of a halo refers us to a dream we never had, and whatever wakes in us when the unseen loon calls offers no consolation. Can I speak of the heart here when nothing speaks to it? Can the night's brush uncover crystals of longing that Master Moon hides in rocks in the beach? Given such suspicion, it is too early to submit to the darkness. You must commit yourself to the light's weave, the distant clarity of a promise you may have misunderstood. Go on, the sunset's Veronica blood promises consonance. You will learn the dark veil's appeal to the light in you.
I'll try to read from Clyde Woods. It's dark, so.
Yeah, where are you? Why is it so dark?
I'm just like weird and being outside. I don't feel like turning on lights.
Oh yeah, I got you. Yeah, close it out. You don't have to keep going. We can just close if you want.
I really want to read this Woods out loud just because I read it. The numbers. There's so many numbers.
Yeah, okay.
Daily Destruction. It's from the chapter called Enclosure Movement, the Enclosure Movement from Development Arrested. The enclosure movement in the Delta was not, as some have argued, based on the transition of feudalism into capitalism. Rather, it marked the movement from capital-scarce, labor-intensive plantation production to capital-intensive, labor-surplus, neo-plantation production. In the process, millions fled the South in horror, and thousands of African-American communities were destroyed seemingly overnight. The Southern enclosure marked the end of African-American population growth and the beginning of a new mass migration out of the region. By 1930, there were 1.2 million African Americans in 12 northeastern states, 1.1 million in 8 Midwestern states, and 1,010,000 in Mississippi alone. By 1950, the African American percentage of Mississippi's population fell below 50% for the first time since the mid-1800s. 986,000 persons of a total of the state population of 2,178,000 persons. Between 1930 and 1950, the Delta's population fell from 619,000 to 609,000 persons, and the African American population declined from 440,000 to 409,000. However, these raw numbers mask the eviction of 1/3 of the sharecropping families and subsequent movement from plantation communities into the hamlets, towns, and cities of the Delta. For example, between 1940 and 1950, the Delta's rural farm population declined dramatically from 316,000 to 257,000 persons. How did this social destruction occur? First, the federally funded enclosure led to the removal of less fertile and marginal lands from popular production. It also led to the eviction of sharecroppers and tenants from the most fertile lands, which were then cultivated using machines and chemicals. Once the relationship between eviction, enclosure, and yields was established, additional evictions generated more funds for equipment purchases, and then even higher yields and even more evictions. This process has been referred to as being tractored off the land. The problem of obtaining high yield and high quality cotton awaited the genetic engineering of varieties specifically adaptable to a new generation of yet undeveloped mechanical cotton pickers, defoliants, and ginning up equipment. Economic activities in the South were diversified based on the introduction of new crops and on new sectors, such as dairying and manufacturing. In the Delta, the last premier cotton region in the South, diversification occurred much more slowly. The Delta plantation bloc was generally hostile to manufacturing because it feared competition, labor shortages, rising wages, and the political and social challenges generated by unionization. The establishment of value-added industries such as textiles and food processing was resisted until near the end of World War II. The Delta Council's view of manufacturing shifted after the organization's leaders became worried that without stable jobs providing an income capable of supporting a family, returning white veterans would leave the region and the African American majority would increase again. Labor relations were marked by the institutionalization of new forms of economic and physical terror that were specifically designed to drive African Americans either materially downward or physically out of the region. Sharecroppers and tenants were evicted, cabins were burned and plowed under, and entire plantation-based communities were leveled. Those evicted expanded the pool of available wage labor and increased the downward pressure on wages in the region. Between 1930 and 1940, the number of tenants in the part of the growing the number of tenants in the region declined by 62%. The day laborers who worked for wages were part of the growing numbers of homeless families created by the AAA. As their plantation houses were destroyed, many were moved to small towns and cities. Large sections of the region's residents became dependent upon the Works Progress Administration for employment, relief payments, and food. This agency also served the needs of the planners, who required that federal relief payments and public work projects be suspended during the harvest in order to force Blacks back into the fields. Under the WPA, Blacks received a minimum wage of $30 a month, while whites received $42. Skilled Blacks were classified as unskilled, and unskilled whites were classified as skilled. As of 10,000 white-collar WPA positions in the state, only of the 10,000 white-collar WPA positions in the state, only 6 were occupied by Blacks. In September 1936, thousands of African-American WPA workers in Mississippi were dismissed in a matter of several days, only to be replaced by white workers. The purpose of this action by federal authorities was to force Blacks into the fields to work as cotton pickers for 50 cents per 100 pounds of cotton picked, and on other jobs paying the same wage rate. This action sparked mass meetings throughout the African-American community. One participant asked the question most pressing on the minds of those attempting to stay in the region. Where is the law and the Constitution? Are we living under the alleged government where all men are said to be created equal under the law? Or are we not living under an administration under which discrimination and the belittling system of caste reign supreme? ? Dependency and exploitation continued to be reproduced through payment structures. One family of African-American sharecroppers reported clearing a profit of only 6 times in 36 years. Hired pickers were paid 60 cents per day in 1932 and $1 a day by 1935. Women cotton pickers made $3 to $6 a week, while domestics earned only between $1.50 and $2.50 a week. As wages rose during World War II, African Americans tried to avoid field and kitchen work that paid starvation wages. Women who received money from their husbands in the armed forces ceased working, especially on Saturdays and Sundays, even though planners established enlisted Black preachers to convince them that it was their patriotic duty to return to the kitchens of their white employers. African Americans who refused to work in the fields found their food allotment cut by the WPA and Mississippi welfare agencies. They were then jailed as vagrants and forced into the fields under armed guard. The prison plantation Parchment Farm awaited those committed to resistance. Much of the Delta production complex was physically structured, sustained, and subsidized by thousands of imprisoned African American men and women. The Delta ethnic and labor control institutions, such as the convict lease system, chain gangs, and the 21,000-acre prison plantation at Parchment, were all nationally infamous for their brutality. After a visit to Parchment, music historian Alan Lomax reported on the lengths that the prisoners went to avoid the torture of daily life. The system of ethnic and labor exploitation was coordinated by the Delta Council and the Mississippi State Employment Service. The latter agency would also identify men and women for cotton picking and, if necessary, arrange transportation. In addition to using Mexican National Guards, using Mexican nationals and German prisoners of war, the council also insisted that selective service boards should defer military service of employees considered critical to production. When the federal government ruled that migratory laborers were to be paid 30 cents an hour minimum wage in 1942, Walter Sillars, then the president of the Delta Council and the Speaker of the Mississippi House of Representatives, obtained a federal exemption for the entire region. In the middle of the Depression, the threat of eviction was devastating. In his 1938's work, Uncle Tom's Children, Richard Wright describes a Delta community fighting against enforced hunger and a preacher's personal struggle to overcome his doubts about leading this movement. Controlled by Delta planters from the bottom to the top, the state and county committees completely ignored profiteering usury, and all manners of fraud while successfully blocking calls for investigations. Consequently, evictions and beatings occurred when tenants' complaints to federal officials in Washington worked their way back to the planner-dominated county committees. The alternatives to agricultural labor were few. Throughout the South, many Blacks had already been bulldozed out of trade and service occupations after 1890, and after every economic downturn, more were forced out of their occupations by unemployed whites. For some, there was still work on the levees. However, the following conversation between bluesman Big Bill Bronzy and Memphis Slim revealed that levee building was extremely a deadly preoccupation. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's pretty much a mic drop. And
That was the numbers.
They don't lie.
Oh, wow. When you get them in the right order. It really feels like it unlocks something. And you're like, whoa. The bootstrap.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. I don't see any reason to punctuate that, you know?
Right, I'm going to turn this one light on because I keep getting bit.
Yeah, I'll edit it down and get it ready tomorrow.
Okay, cool. When are you gonna show it?
I think we're gonna do like the 7th of July or something like that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Maybe I can give you some pictures from Brown Sugar and Unseen.
Yeah, I was gonna say if you want me to like screen anything before or have any other images or stuff, just go ahead and send that to me and I can edit that in.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. It was really nice. Look at all my books over here.
Oh, I know. It's so nice.
Oh, nice. Oh, yeah.
With the chicken. Oh my God, this mosquito is being crazy. Wow. I just got bit like right on my vein.
Yeah, the mosquitoes here are acting reckless too. It's fucked up.
Just reckless. I'm like, what is your whole ass life? Okay.
I'm gonna start wearing jackets and shit.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna go off the live.
Yeah, I need to cook some food, so I'm gonna go ahead and go do that. Thank you so much for doing this, Kandis.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll keep you posted on the edits and stuff.
Cool, yeah, and let's meet like maybe in a couple of days, like on Tuesday, to go through your class and who everybody is and stuff.